Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 41 of Gunnerkrigg Court, Changes. Now, this video might be a little bit long, so please bear with me. And that's because this is the final chapter of the fourth book, Materia, and I wanted to touch on a lot of points that were being developed plot-wise up to this moment. And the materia in the title of the book refers to the raw materials that is used in the alchemical process. And that's kind of reflected in the book as a whole, but also in this chapter, by my gathering of the components of the story and then mixing them all together. Because at this point in the comic, as the story's been going on for quite some time, I really felt that there was a lot going on that was working together as one big cohesive whole. And I wanted to use this chapter as a way to bring a lot of that stuff back to light. And the story starts off with Robot and Shadow getting a bit closer. And I really wanted to give the impression with these two that they spend a lot of time away from the other cast, and their characters and their relationships are really developing off-screen. And we can kind of see that here when Robot gets attacked by these Seraph model robots. We see that they have devised their own little escape plan, possibly because Robot knew that something like this was going to happen at some point. And we see that Shadow is able to use his body in different ways now. He's come a long way from the very unstable and fragile character that he was when he first started becoming three-dimensional. And then next, the scene shifts to Annie, Kat, and Renard, and they're talking to Lindsay. And up until this point, Annie and Renard have been sharing a room, and I thought it was worth mentioning that that might be a little bit awkward. And so this was the impetus for Annie and Kat to start sharing a room together. And so while they're setting up and talking about things that will be brought up later in the chapter, Shadow comes running up and lets them know that Robot was kidnapped, essentially. So the Scooby Gang come and help figure out what's going on. And at this point, Kat hasn't actually ever met the Seraph robots. She's only ever seen the original model down in her little robot museum underground underneath her workshop. So she's not really had much experience with them. So it doesn't really take them long to figure out the robot's super secret headquarters and hiding place. And they're able to find Robot, who's chained up. And just as a little note, Robot's actual kidnapping and the search for Robot was not intended to be the focus of this chapter, which is why it kind of happens and then gets resolved fairly quickly. It's the consequences and the reasons for Robot being kidnapped and what happens afterwards that is really the focus here. So they find Robot pretty quickly, and they have a bit of a showdown with the robots. Kat has the disruptor that Donnie had back in the Ties chapter, but it's actually Annie that helps take down the Seraph models. And things like this, as well as Robot referring to them as brothers, because he did used to be one of these robots, is kind of shows the callbacks that I'm using to a lot of the stuff that happened earlier in the story. Because I just like to bring back a lot of bits and pieces that readers might remember, and it's fun to call back to things that happened earlier in the story. And after calming the robots down and agreeing to show them Kat's work, we kind of get an update on what Kat's been up to, and we see that she's really been making a lot of progress on her work with the original coding of the robots and the new process that she's focusing on, where she's trying to create a new type of body for Robot. And so this draws together a couple of the threads in the story. And so while Kat and the robots are messing around, it is time for Annie to leave and go into her side of the chapter, which is the final announcement of who's going to be the medium between the court and the forest. And this in itself is a big throwback to the end of the first book, where Annie and pretty much all of these characters are meeting in this large meeting room. And time has really passed now. We can see that they've grown and changed as characters. Although when Coyote and Asengrin arrive, the last time that Annie saw Asengrin was when he attacked her in the forest, so she's still not quite sure what to think about him. But we, the readers, know that Asengrin has had his mind tampered with, so he doesn't remember the incident at all. But aside from that, this is an element of the plot that has been a long time coming, and it's really what Annie and Parley and Smitty have been working to for a while now. But when it comes to declare the new medium, we can see that the court has basically ignored Jones's advice and picked Andrew as the new medium, which leads to a bit of an internal squabble. Nobody really knew that the court was going to choose this way. And it's really in situations like this that Coyote has a fun time. He gets to play around and he sort of revels in the chaos of the moment. And of course he gets to become a bit of a spanner in the works himself, and officially makes Annie an honorary citizen of the forest, and their own counterpart to what Andrew has become, which is to say she's now the forest representative to the court, whereas she was training up at this point to be the representative of the court to the forest. And so this was never really on the books up until now, and true to Coyote's nature, he's just decided on it on the spot. And while the court being characterized by the headmaster here, is not really happy with the idea. The other characters stand up for Annie, which leads her to accept the position and really open up the next sequence of events that's going to be happening in the story. And so after this, we head to the wind-down scene of the chapter and the book, where Annie and Kat are just chatting and catching up about things. And we can see already that Kat's had her influence on the room that she and Annie are sharing. Up until now, the rooms inside this underwater dormitory have been very cold and blue, but now that Kat's here, she's strung up some fairy lights and cast a very warm glow over the place, made it a lot more homely. And I wanted this scene to seem very different to the past scenes that happened at the end of each book, where Annie is basically left alone and they're quite solitary scenes, but here she gets to end the book with her friend in a much more comfortable and friendly atmosphere. And in fact, despite the important stuff that happened in this chapter, I decided to end this and the book with a much more mundane cliffhanger in which it's revealed that Kat has received a love letter from someone. And so that's the end of that chapter, and as usual at the end of each book I'll do one of these treatise pages, and I like to just mention some of the symbolism that is going on here. So we can see that right in the centre Annie and Kat are overlapping each other now, and they're holding hands, and they're much closer than they have ever been before. And just above them we can see that Robot and Shadow are also holding hands. They're two creations of their respective factions in this world, but much like Annie and Kat, they are closely linked. And this section at the top of the picture is a representation of how a lot of alchemists pictured the world back in the day. They kind of saw layers of reality and the physical world and the non-physical world as very literal spheres in which things existed. So we can see that here in the real world everything is taking place, but outside of that barrier is the sphere of the heavens, in which we can see there are a couple of elements that exist. Like this round thing over here. The wheel shape is an old way of representing an angel, but instead of having eyes around the outer rim, I've used the symbol for a photodiode, and on the other side I've depicted the satellite here that was represented in Microsat 5, and even though it's a machine, I've used representation of a real eye in the middle, an eye which is clouded over, as if it's looking over everything but not quite seeing truly. And their positions on the picture are very deliberate, with the angelic representation being on the side of technology over the court, and then the very mechanical satellite being over the forest here, which is generally where all the etheric and magical stuff resides. And right in the middle we have Jones, the symbol here for the wandering eye, in a very neutral position. And we have other smaller elements like a Sengren over here with a section of his mind disconnected. And I won't explain everything that's going on in this picture here. I'd like to leave some for the readers to dwell on themselves. But the treatise pages are always good fun for me to work on. I think they make a nice composition that allow me to bring together a lot of what's happened in the book as a whole, and I'm usually pretty pleased with how they come out at the end. And I think this one is one of my favourites to date. But anyway, that is the end of this chapter and the end of Book 4, Materia. Come back again for Chapter 42, Catalyst.